Hi, today's video is on knowing when to move on. And I wanted to start with an example from the Old Testament. It's found in 1 Samuel chapters 15 and 16, and it involves King Saul and the prophet Samuel. In chapter 15 of 1 Samuel, we find the prophet Samuel giving instruction to King Saul that he was to go and punish the Amalekites. God had given that nation into the hands of Israel, and they were to wipe them out to a man. And the reason for this was because they had sin, and the sin was so deep and so pervasive that the only way that it could be taken care of would be to just start over. And so, just like God used fire and brimstone with Sodom and Gomorrah to wipe out the wicked people of that time, and just as he used water to wipe out the world of its wicked people during their time, now God was going to use the nation of Israel to wipe out the Amalekites. Their sin had just gotten that bad. And so Samuel, in 1 Samuel 15, gave the instruction from God to King Saul that he was to go to battle with the Amalekites and wipe them out, every person and every animal. And so the battle was fought, and God gave them the victory. But Saul didn't obey completely. He allowed the king of the Amalekites to live. And then they spared the best of the cattle and the sheep. They were going to keep that for themselves. And so along comes Samuel. And Samuel asks him, what's going on? And Saul said, I've obeyed the Lord in everything. And Samuel had that famous line, then what is this sound of the bleating of sheep in my ears? And so King Saul had to admit that they didn't kill them all, but King Saul blamed it on the people. He said they wanted to keep these animals so that they could sacrifice them to the Lord. And Samuel said this, in verse 22, does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifice as much as in obeying the voice of the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. Well, that was the message that Samuel had to give to King Saul, but it still grieved Samuel that Saul was going to be removed in this way. And so at the end of chapter 15 in 1 Samuel, it says in verse 35, until the day Samuel died, he did not go to see Saul again, though Samuel mourned for him, and the Lord was grieved that he had made Saul king. Well, here we have Samuel giving the judgment of the Lord to King Saul, but it said he still mourned for the fact that Saul was no longer going to be king, that he was going to be punished. And so in chapter 16, verse 1, it says this, the Lord said to Samuel, how long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I'm sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem, for I have chosen one of his sons to be king. And so essentially God is just saying this to Samuel, move on. It's time to get over this mourning for the fact that Saul has sinned and can no longer be king. There is still work to be done. And so God essentially told the prophet Samuel, you've got to move on. They did need a king, Israel, and it needed to be a king that was going to be a man who would be obedient to God. He was going to be far superior to Saul in every way. And Samuel just had to accept the judgment of the Lord in this. And so Samuel, in effect, was told, it's time to move on. And then one last example, and this involves the king that actually replaced King Saul. It was King David. And you remember the events of David with Bathsheba. But by way of summary, it essentially happened this way. David committed adultery with Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. To compound things, to make it even worse, Uriah was one of David's mighty men. In other words, Uriah was a war hero. And David committed adultery with Uriah's wife. And then he tried to cover it up. And when he couldn't cover it up, he had Uriah placed in one of the most dangerous parts of the battle so that he would be killed. And it happened just that way. In effect, King David murdered Uriah with the army that they were fighting, but he did so in a way where it wouldn't look like he had done so. He thought he had gotten away with it. He took Bathsheba into his home. Bathsheba was pregnant with a son, and he was just going along until Nathan the prophet came to David, and he told him a story about a man who had hardly anything. He was a poor man, but he had one little lamb that he treated like a daughter. He would hold it in his arms, he would feed it, and he showed compassion towards that little lamb. Some of you who've been close to a pet will understand this. And then Nathan, in this little parable he was telling, said that there was another man, a rich man, who had all sorts of flocks, but he didn't want to take a lamb from his own flock, so he took the poor man's lamb and he killed it. Well, this made David mad. David didn't know this was just a parable, and David said, the man deserves to die who did this, but he must pay back 4 times what he had stolen. See, David knew the law well enough to know that the remedy for stealing a lamb was repayment of 4 lambs. But somehow, David had missed the part about even a king shouldn't be committing adultery and murder. And so when David said to Nathan the prophet, that man deserves to die, Nathan said, you are the man. And then all the sins came back upon David. And David was sorry for his sins. And he was told that God had forgiven those sins. But look what else he says. In verse 13 of 2 Samuel chapter 12, David said to Nathan, I've sinned against the Lord. Nathan replied, the Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die. But because by doing this, you have made the enemies of the Lord show utter contempt. The son born to you will die. That doesn't seem fair, does it? This baby has done nothing, and yet because of David's sin, the baby has to die? How could that be? Well, Nathan explains it. At least he gives us an understanding of it. Because David had committed this terrible sin, the birth of that son would remind the enemies of God what had happened, and it would allow them an opportunity to blaspheme against God. And so this son that was born could never be king. It would just be disaster on that. And so God was going to take the son. He wasn't going to punish him for all eternity. As a matter of fact, this may have been the most gentle thing that could have been done to that child. It's not a parent's responsibility to be able to do this, but God did, in fact, do this, and it was punishment to David. Well, when David heard this, shortly after that, the baby got sick, and David mourned, and he fasted. He wouldn't eat. He wept for 7 days, we're told. And his servants would try to get him to eat, and David would not stop. He beseeched God not to punish the baby, not to take the baby for David's sin. But the son did die. And the servants were afraid to go and tell David. If he had acted that way while he was still alive, what was he going to do? David saw the servants whispering together, and he just asked them point blank, has the child died? And they said yes. And so we're told David got up, washed himself, and ate. Well, it said in verse 21 of chapter 12, his servants asked him, why are you acting this way? While the child was alive, you fasted and wept, but now that the child is dead, you get up and eat? David answered, while the child was still alive, I fasted and wept. I thought, who knows? The Lord may be gracious to me and let the child live. But now that he is dead, why should I fast? Can I bring him back? I will go to him, but he will not return to me. David's point was a good one. As long as the child lived, there was hope. The child had not sinned. The punishment was not because of anything that the child had done. And so David thought if he would beseech God, that there was a chance that God might spare the son. But of course, God didn't choose to in that instance. And when David found out that the child's fate was sealed, that he was now dead, he moved on. He got up and cleaned himself up and ate and got back on with life. Well, a lot of hard things within these two examples, but the one thing that I think that we can really get out of it is this. There does come a time in our life where we're involved in something that we just so badly want to happen. Maybe you're dating somebody you just really want to marry and they break up with you, or they never will date you. And finally, there comes a day where they get married to somebody else. You got to move on. There are times when we have situations like David did where a loved one is sick, and for whatever reason, they go ahead and pass. I guess only God knows the reasons for why certain people die out of season. But when we have a loved one that happens to, it's very difficult to handle. A lot of couples, when they lose a child, the pressure will become so unbearable to them because their focus is upon their own loss instead of asking God for help and accepting God's will on that, or at least what happened. They just kind of come apart. And a lot of marriages come apart at this point. A man and a woman who loved each other but have some kind of a crisis in their life, they divorce. Why? And the answer is they haven't learned to move on yet. We all have had situations like that. We've really wanted this job bad. We've really wanted to buy a house that we just couldn't afford or we couldn't obtain. We want to move somewhere that we don't get to. We want to be on the team, first string. We want to be a starter. We want to make really good grades and go on to great things. And for whatever reasons, our plans, which would be acceptable as far as things like getting married and hoping that a loved one doesn't die and so on, but once we find out that there is no possibility to have what we want, we've got to move on. And the only way you can do that is with God's help. God helped Samuel to see that it was time to get over the fact that Saul wasn't going to be king anymore and get back to the business. God helped David see that once his son had died, that there was nothing he could do, so now it was time to get back on with life. Of course, there was still grief, there was still mourning, but there was work to be done. There was life to be lived. You can't just stop everything. There are times where we just have to understand it's time to move on. And by understanding that, by accepting that God's final decision isn't always what we want, or even if something happens that wasn't God's will because somebody sinned in that instance and caused something terrible to happen to us and we can't change that event, we just have to at some point come to the realization that it just is and we need to move on. There was a inscription over an ancient monastery that had just a plaque with this inscription over it that said something along the lines, when it was interpreted, "It is so, it cannot be otherwise." And the idea behind that was essentially what God has been trying to teach us all throughout history and all of our personal lives. There comes a point where it's just time to move on. And even though we will have great disappointments in life, life still goes on. And there are wonderful opportunities for us left in this life. I think there's a lot of us who were in love with this girl, or ladies, you might have been in love with some young man and it just didn't work out. But then you met the one that you're married to right now and you realize that God really gave you a tremendous gift. God really does know what he's doing. And so let's just learn to accept his will when it is his will. Let's learn to accept the facts when somebody sins and does something that is not God's will, but which costs us something that we tremendously desire. Whatever the case is, whether a righteous decision or an unrighteous act, we need to understand that there are certain times we just need to move on and then to build a really good life from where we are. We can spend our entire life mourning the things that didn't turn out the way we wanted them to, or we can spend the rest of our life doing something productive for God and something enjoyable for ourselves and something that will help others. But the only way we're ever going to do that is if we learn there are certain points where we just have to move on. Well, that's the video for today. I hope it's something that gives you some encouragement in some areas maybe that you're having trouble with, and maybe you can encourage others with these thoughts as well. But until next time, I appreciate your viewing today, and I hope we will see you tomorrow. God bless.